The air inside the grand courtroom was thick with tension, as though the polished mahogany walls themselves were holding their breath. Every rustle of paper, every shuffle of shoes, seemed magnified, echoing across the chamber like thunder. At the very center of the nation's attention sat Justice Samuel Alito. His posture was relaxed, his robes pooling at the edges of the bench, and across his face lingered something that seemed far too casual for the gravity of the proceedings, a smirk. It wasn't wide enough to be a grin, nor sharp enough to be a sneer, but it carried all the weight of dismissal. He looked down at the speaker before him, Representative Jasmine Crockett, as though her words were little more than noise fluttering against the stone walls. The case at hand was monumental, one that would shape lives for decades to come. But in that moment, all eyes shifted away from the legal documents and precedents. The tension no longer belonged to the case, it belonged to the clash between one of the highest judges in the land and one of the most unflinching lawmakers standing before him. Crockett, dressed in a sharply cut navy suit that commanded attention, had been speaking with precision, her voice rising and falling in rhythms that captured the room. Her cadence was not that of a dry legal argument but of lived conviction. She wove statistics with stories, law with life, creating a narrative too urgent to be ignored. But then she caught it, that smirk. That flicker of disdain, subtle but undeniable. She stopped mid-sentence. The silence was instant, electric. The reporters in the gallery lowered their pens, sensing something about to shift. Her gaze locked on Alito, unflinching, steady, bold. The pause stretched into seconds, long enough that a few in the gallery exchanged glances. Some thought she might falter, lose her footing. But the pause was not hesitation, it was calculation. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a sharp edge, a blade hidden inside velvet. "You find this funny, Justice Alito?" The question landed like a hammer on stone. Gasps rippled through the chamber. Even in heated debates, it was rare, unheard of, even, for anyone to address a justice so directly, so brazenly. Alito adjusted his glasses, his smirk stiffening. He said nothing, but the silence itself was a dare. His expression seemed to say, "Go ahead. Try me." Crockett did not flinch. Instead, her words erupted with a clarity that made the air hum. She recounted past rulings, dissected the patterns of dismissive attitudes cloaked in judicial neutrality, and exposed how those choices had real, devastating consequences on everyday people. Her voice rose, not in volume but in intensity, like a tide pulling everything in its path. "This smirk," she declared, her fingers subtly pointing upward toward the bench, "might work behind closed doors. But in front of the American people, it is an insult. An insult to every woman fighting for her right to decide. An insult to every worker who believes justice should mean fairness. And an insult to the very institution you have sworn to uphold." The gallery erupted into whispers. Some reporters scribbled furiously, others just watched, their pens frozen in the air. The other justices shifted uncomfortably, their eyes darting between Alito and Crockett. Even the stenographer, tasked with impartial recording, seemed to hesitate at the rhythm of her words, as though trying to capture not just the letters but the force behind them. Alito's smirk faltered. He leaned forward slightly, his jaw tightening, his eyes narrowing. The confidence, the untouchable authority that came with decades on the bench, suddenly seemed thinner, shakier under the weight of Crockett's fire. She wasn't simply speaking to him, she was speaking to the millions beyond those walls, to the cameras clicking wildly, to history itself. She invoked names, stories of ordinary people who would never stand in this courtroom but whose futures would be determined by the decisions made here. "Your smirk may dismiss me," she said, her voice now resonant and commanding, "but it cannot dismiss them. It cannot dismiss the pain of mothers, the struggle of workers, the fight of communities who are demanding that justice means something more than words carved into marble." The room was silent. Even those who had entered indifferent now felt a shift, an invisible current pulling them into the weight of the moment. Crockett stood unwavering, her shoulders squared, her eyes blazing. Alito's expression, once smug, now looked unsettled, his composure fractured. By the time she stepped back, the smirk was gone. What lingered instead was something heavier, a silence thick with realization. The kind of silence that told everyone present they had just witnessed not just a courtroom exchange, but a turning point. A woman had stood before power, called it out, and refused to let it hide behind robes or rituals. And in that moment, Jasmine Crockett's voice wasn't just heard, it was felt. The echoes of Jasmine Crockett's fiery courtroom takedown had barely faded across the nation when, on the other side of the cultural spectrum, a very different kind of storm erupted, this time not in a courthouse but on live morning television. Millions tuned in, expecting the usual blend of laughter, light-hearted games, and cheerful banter that had made Today with Jenna and Friends a weekday staple. Instead, what they witnessed was a confrontation so raw, so unfiltered, that it set the internet ablaze before the cameras had even cut to commercial. Kelly Clarkson, America's sweetheart with the powerhouse voice and the unshakable charm, was invited on as the day's headlining guest. At first, the set was glowing with good energy. Kelly smiled, cracked a few jokes, and even sang a playful line when Jenna asked about her upcoming tour. The audience clapped warmly, ready for an easy hour. But beneath her smile, there was a sharpness in Kelly's eyes, a quiet tension that only the most observant viewers could spot. Something was waiting, simmering beneath the surface. The conversation began innocently enough. They talked about music, her kids, and the demands of juggling fame with real life. Then the mood shifted. One of Jenna's co-hosts, trying to stir the pot with a provocative question, made a comment about the protests and voices of dissent rising across the country. At the end of the day, the co-host quipped with a shrug, "It's just a lot of noise, isn't it? People yelling to be heard without actually offering solutions." It was meant to be a throwaway remark, a line to transition into lighter chatter. But for Kelly, it was a spark to dry timber. Her smile froze, then fell. The studio audience, always quick to read body language, murmured softly, sensing a break in the tone. Jenna glanced at Kelly, eyebrows lifting slightly, as if silently urging her to glide past the moment. But Kelly didn't. She couldn't. "I'm sorry," she said suddenly, her voice carrying a new weight. The laughter died instantly. "You don't get to call people's pain noise. Not when they're fighting to be heard." The words hit the studio like a lightning strike. The live audience gasped, some clapping in nervous solidarity, others holding their breath in shock. Jenna shifted in her chair, her smile faltering as she tried to gauge whether to intervene. The co-host laughed awkwardly, clearly trying to brush it off. "Oh, come on, Kelly, you know what I meant." But Kelly wasn't done. Her voice, usually warm and melodic, now rang with the steel of conviction. She spoke about empathy, about what it means to actually listen to people instead of dismissing them when their demands feel uncomfortable. "We sit here in our nice clothes, sipping coffee on national TV," she said, gesturing to the mugs on the table, "and there are people out there fighting every single day just to be acknowledged. Calling that noise isn't just wrong, it's cruel." The audience erupted into applause this time, loud and insistent, drowning out any attempt to smooth things over. Jenna raised her hands, trying to steady the energy, but Kelly's momentum only grew. Her voice sharpened, her passion radiating. She spoke about her own journey, about times she had felt dismissed in the music industry, about how the label of noise is always slapped onto those trying hardest to change things. The tension reached a boiling point. Jenna attempted to interject, Okay, let's all take a breath here," but Kelly cut in, her voice unshakable. "No, Jenna, I'm not going to sit here and pretend everything's fine while we minimize people who are begging this country to do better." That was the moment. Kelly's chair scraped against the studio floor as she pushed back and rose to her feet. The cameras, scrambling to adjust, caught her full frame as she looked straight into the audience. "If this is what this show stands for," she declared, her voice steady and fierce, "then I don't want to be part of it." Gasps rippled through the room. Jenna's eyes widened, her co-hosts froze mid-breath, and the control room panicked as producers barked orders into headsets. But before anyone could stop her, Kelly turned on her heel and stormed off the stage. The live audience, caught between shock and exhilaration, exploded into a mix of applause and stunned silence. Seconds later, the screen cut abruptly to commercial, but the damage, or the impact, depending on perspective, was already done. Within minutes, clips of Kelly's walk-off flooded Twitter, TikTok, and Instagram. Hashtags trended globally. Hashtag Kelly walks off. Hashtag not noise. Hashtag respect the voices. Commentators praised her for standing firm in the face of dismissal, comparing her fiery exit to Jasmine Crockett's courtroom moment earlier in the week. Others criticized her, calling the move dramatic or unprofessional. But even the critics couldn't deny one truth. Kelly Clarkson had taken a stand, and in doing so, she had transformed a routine morning show into a cultural flashpoint. The parallels were impossible to ignore. A congresswoman in court, a singer on live TV, two women in two very different arenas, refusing to let power minimize or silence the voices of the people. And in both spaces, their words reverberated far beyond walls or camera lenses. They struck chords. They demanded attention. And they reminded everyone watching that sometimes, the most powerful act isn't staying seated, it's standing up, speaking out, and walking away when silence is no longer an option.